Several countries are looking at how best to tackle the threat of the Islamic State. They've promised to carry out attacks against IS fighters and provide weaponry to the Iraqi government. But what about the group itself? How did it come about? The Islamic State and its root causes. This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hazem Seeker. The US is putting together a coalition of partners with one common goal: destroying the Islamic State. US Secretary of State John Kerry has shored up Saudi Arabia's support for President Obama's proposed war, along with 9 other countries in the region. US officials have said part of President Obama's strategy is to provide Syrian rebels with American military training on Saudi soil. Kerry has also been to Turkey, which has so far been unwilling to join the coalition. By some estimates, a third of Iraq is under Islamic State control. The group's so-called caliphate in Iraq consists mainly of Sunni majority areas, particularly Al-Anbar province. The group has taken on an equally large part of Syria. The Islamic State has consolidated its control over these areas, which the government lost over the course of Syria's 3-year war. Raqqa has also become the group's de facto capital. Well, with us now to discuss this in more detail, I'm joined by our 3 guests from Beirut. Mario Abu Zaid, he is a political analyst with the Carnegie Middle East Centre. In Cardiff, in the UK, we have Ayman Jawad al-Tamimi, who is a fellow with the Middle East Forum and specialises in radical Islamic groups in Iraq and Syria. And joining us from Michigan, Juan Cole, history professor with the University of Michigan and author of the book, The New Arabs, How the Millennial Generation is Changing the Middle East. He joins us from Ann Arbor in Michigan. Thank you all for being with us. Mario Abu Zaid, what about we talked there at the beginning about the United States gathering this coalition to tackle Islamic State by force. But there is this school of thought that says you can bomb all you want, but to tackle, you're not going to get anywhere until you tackle the root cause of all of this. What do you say to that?
I think it is not enough just to go there and attack this group from a military perspective, because what actually helped this group at emerging goes way beyond military tactics and military strength as well as resources this group has. It goes beyond that. It is about ideological, religious and sectarian trends that are emerging. And this group actually benefited from the alienation of the Sunnite community across the region, as well as it is investing in the resentment that the Sunni community all over the region has feeling. In addition, the security power vacuum that was created after the withdrawal of the US troops from Iraq actually helped in developing the capabilities of this group, which gave him these tremendous successes we were witnessing in the past few months.
Ayman Jawad al-Tamimi, where does IS derive its power, in your view, in Iraq and Syria?
I think when answering this question, it's important not to reduce it to a single or main overarching explanation. There are many causes for the Islamic State's current extent of power and control. So for example, yes, it's true there's this issue of Sunni feelings of marginalization and alienation, which particularly apply to Iraq, and that foremost translates to the problem that locals often wouldn't work with the security forces, so it facilitates the environment in which the Islamic State could operate. So, for example, Iraqi security forces engaging in mass arrests and so on, also detention for years of individuals for years, often without any word of a trial or the like. But also, though, one has to remember that in Syria, the Islamic State hasn't exactly been welcomed in with open arms because people felt oppressed. There were multiple ways in which the Islamic State asserted itself in Syria. So, for example, divisions among rebels about whether they wanted to fight the Islamic State or not from the very beginning. So, for example, many were sympathetic to the Islamic State ideologically with this idea of establishing the caliphate, and you see how that translates to, for example, in the Islamic State's assertion of power in Haska province from the very beginning of this year, when it subsumed all these other different groups like Ahrar al-Sham and so on under its wing in Haska province, because many of them were sympathetic to the Islamic State in the first place. So it was easy then for the Islamic State to establish itself within much of eastern Syria, also taking advantage of divisions among the rebels generally. You know, rather than rebels having unified coalitions, you could see even, say, in one town, for example, in Deir ez-Zor province, you'd have 6 factions in the main town, and you'd have even more factions among in the countryside. So that's an easy. So when it comes to a military face-off between the Islamic State and these other groups, if there are divisions among the other groups, then it's not surprising if the Islamic State could win out in the end.
Juan Carl, when we look at a group like Islamic State, it obviously has these characteristics of a very kind of puritanical version of Islam, very similar to other radical groups throughout the world. But is this about a religious zeal, or is it more, I mean, is that just a symptom of the problem? Is it more about just an absence of state power, a political vacuum in those areas?
Well, it's partly growing out of the maelstrom of these wars in Iraq and Syria. In Syria, something on the order of half the population has been made homeless by these wars, either internally displaced or externally displaced. Nearly 200,000 people dead, probably 600,000 wounded, in a country of 22 million. So, I think it's similar in some ways to the situation in Cambodia at the end of the Vietnam War, when you had the radical Khmer Rouge take over, in which hundreds of thousands, over 1 million, were killed. These situations of social dislocation encourage radicalism. In a situation where there's no law and order, someone who comes along and provides a lot of it can be valued. Or it's a social disciplining that can be imposed on people as a way of asserting governmental authority on the part of non-state actors. So I think its roots lie very little in theology and very much in the turmoil and turbulence that these societies are experiencing.
And Juan Carl, I know you've written about this extensively, but how much of this is down to the perceived failures of the Maliki government in Baghdad, particularly in the last 3 years since most of the U.S. troops withdrew?
Yes, I think it should be remembered that in the early zeros, whenever anyone brought up the idea of partitioning Iraq, and including when then Senator Joe Biden made such a suggestion, the Iraqi parliamentarians on the Sunni side vocally dismissed this idea and denounced it. The Sunni Arab population of Iraq had been devoted to national unity, and I think the long years of the Nouri al-Maliki government did alienate and marginalize them to the point where some of them began talking about secession just because the conditions under which they had to live were so horrible. You know, the army, the Iraqi army, which garrisoned a place like Mosul, was increasingly Shiite in coloration. Well, it looked like an occupation to people. There weren't jobs, the oil wealth wasn't being shared, the services were horrible, and then people were humiliated. And Nouri al-Maliki, accused his own Sunni vice president of terrorism and chased him from the country, wanted to try him. So this alienation of the Sunni Arabs began under the American occupation, and it had to do with American policies and those of their Shiite and Kurdish allies in the beginning. But al-Maliki continued those policies at a time when he should have been reaching out to the Sunnis.
Mario Abu Zaid, what's been surprising to many people, I think, about the rise of IS has been the speed of their success and just how quickly they've been able to gain all of this territory in Iraq and Syria. What do you put that down to?
In order to understand how did ISIS was successful in expanding in such a fast track, we need to go back to the roots of this organization that goes back even to Osama bin Laden rhetoric and its ideology. Actually, the emergence of ISIS came long after the death of Osama bin Laden, as well as the split that happened with the Nusra Front. As a matter of fact, after the Zarqawi was responsible of Al-Qaeda group in Iraq that was called by that time the Islamic State of Iraq, Zarqawi had been using ruthless tools and methods that were refused completely by Ayman al-Zawahiri, the one who succeeded Osama bin Laden. And as a matter of fact, Zarqawi was successful in its operation definitely against the US troops in Iraq, causing more than 4,500 casualties from among, as well as the civilian casualties. And it helped actually improve the situation of its organization, which gave him more power on the ground. And he was able to control more of the jihadist scene inside Iraq and to have some political exposure. After the killing of Mus'ab al-Zarqawi, we saw that the emergence of al-Baghdadi, who was a co-founder of the Nusra Front in Syria, and the way he forced, if you want, the Nusra leader by that time, al-Julani, he was asking for his obedience in order to create the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. And while the Nusra Front leader refused by completely joining al-Baghdadi's government and by sticking to al-Zawahiri ideology, this is when the split happened. And al-Baghdadi learned from all the mistakes of whether al-Zawahiri or from the mistakes of other terrorist organization and jihadist group inside Iraq and outside of it. As a matter of fact, al-Baghdadi was successful in creating coalitions with Sunni tribal leaders in Iraq, which actually helped him in controlling greater areas by having their support and creating a Sunni enabling environment that allowed such a small force at the beginning of a couple of thousand of fighters to control tremendous size of territory. This was strategically made by creating alliances with Sunni tribal leaders and with Sunni communities on the ground.
All right.
Secondly, after creating those alliances...
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes.
Just finish your point briefly, and I'll come to Ayman in a second.
After creating those alliances, al-Baghdadi moved into controlling resources. And in order to be able to expand and declare its caliphate, he needed the economical resources. And he was looking at large-scale resources. This is why he tried to control al-Raqqa with all in Syria, with all its oil and gas resources, and to control, for example, in Mosul, all the banks and central banks. And by gathering these huge amounts of financial resources as weapons, this actually helped him recruit fighters and expand in a tremendous way.
Ayman Jamal Tamimi, what about this idea that, when you talk about many of these disaffected groups in both Iraq and Syria, and they see the tremendous growth of IS just within the last few months, they are seen to many people as a kind of a winning team right now. What about this idea that people want to join the winning team? They want to join a group that is seen as gaining a lot of ground?
That's definitely true, actually. So we saw in Syria the collapse of rebel resistance to the Islamic State in the east, particularly in Deir ez-Zor province. That was facilitated by the perception the Islamic State was winning. The rebels had pushed out the Islamic State briefly from Deir ez-Zor province in the beginning of this year, but the Islamic State very quickly pushed back and pushed deeply into Deir ez-Zor province, and this is well before actually the fall of Mosul, and so on, and these transfers of new US-made weapons and vehicles into Syria to assist the Islamic State's effort to seize more territory within Syria. So yes, this winning team perception is certainly true, and it also applies to Iraq, actually. We see actually in Mosul, for example, there was actually a coalition of groups the Islamic State spearheaded the fall of that city from government control, but there was more than one group involved. For example, there is this rival jihadi group in Iraq called Jamaat Ansar al-Islam, it was an evolution out of an Al-Qaeda affiliate in Iraqi Kurdistan. But the point is, they helped in the takeover of Mosul, actually, but increasingly, with the Islamic State's assertion of its power and weapons, and of its wealth and weapons and military strength, many members of this group have ended up pledging allegiance to the Islamic State in Mosul, actually, and it's gone to and that's partly the perception that IS is the winning horse to back, but also in this case it's facilitated by ideological overlap, because Jamaat Ansar al-Islam believes in the caliphate, and it's since the Islamic State declares itself to be a caliphate, well, why not join that? So it's actually gone to the point in Mosul where this group, Jamaat Ansar al-Islam, can no longer assert itself openly in the city. So so I think it's definitely true that this perception of Islamic State as the winning horse leads many people, even those actually who are not particularly into IS's ideology of the caliphate, end up joining the group, and we've seen that in Syria as well.
Juan Cole, we talked earlier about the destructive policies of the Baghdad government and all of the mistakes that they made in alienating so many people in Iraq. But if we go back even further than that, to the 2003 US-led invasion, how much of what we're seeing now is down to that moment?
Well, it's very foundational. The United States invasion and occupation of Iraq created the conditions under which these radical Sunni groups grew up. Iraqis had been nationalists. They had been organized by the Ba'ath Party, which was extremely repressive. But about half of the middle and lower level functionaries in the party were Shiite. The Sunnis dominated up at the top and were predominant, but there were even Shiite generals and so forth. So the Ba'ath Party was a multicultural one-party state, and quite horrible, but nevertheless did have buy-in broadly in the country, and the U.S. overthrew it. And in the absence of this secular nationalist vehicle, religious and ethnic identities came to the fore, and the United States encouraged that development. And as I said before, they actually cooperated with Shiite politicians, most of whom had been in exile in London, to stigmatize the Ba'ath Party as a kind of Nazism, and to declare that all members of the former members of the Ba'ath Party would be excluded from public life, fired from government jobs, and somehow that policy wasn't implemented so vigorously in the Shiite South, but in the Sunni Arab areas it was, and so you had vast unemployment. The U.S. Administration was hostile to socialism, so it simply closed the government factories, hoping that the magic hand of entrepreneurship would replace them. It didn't. So there was vast unemployment in the Sunni Arab areas, and there were changes in status. So proud Sunni Arabs who were state managers of various sorts were reduced to unemployment or to menial employment. And as the Shiites and the Kurds were promoted into power by the Americans, it became clear that this situation could go on forever, that the Sunni Arabs had suffered a permanent loss of power and wealth in a country where they had really been on top, and no ruling elite would accept such a thing. So it's the opposite of what was done in South Africa, where the Afrikaner whites were allowed to keep much of their wealth, even though they had to surrender a good deal of political power.
Ayman, we talked up to this point about all of the internal factors going on here that have contributed to the rise of IS. And you know, if this isn't about religion, if this is more about politics and people there disenfranchised, how do we explain all of the foreign fighters that have come in to places like Syria and Iraq from the West? What do you put that down to?
It's important to stress that actually with regards to the foreign fighter phenomenon in Iraq, this is actually pretty much comes exclusively through Syria. So foreign fighters will go into Syria, then they'll enter into Iraq, and that's tied to, of course, the fact that the vast majority of foreign fighters who've entered the Syria-Iraq arena joined the Islamic State. And there are multiple reasons for that. Firstly is that it is easier to join the Islamic State than other jihadi groups like Jabhat al-Nusra, for example. I think there are more rigorous entry criteria for a group like Jabhat al-Nusra as opposed to the Islamic State. I mean, the Islamic State, as long as you pledge allegiance to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and to his caliphate, there's no problem, you're a member. Secondly, though, is that the contrasting with Jabhat al-Nusra, which is Syria's al-Qaeda affiliate, to remember, the Islamic State has placed a lot more emphasis, and going back at least a year now, on the ultimately global nature of its struggle, and the idea that this Islamic State has no borders and it will eventually encompass the entire world. I think that appeals to the idealism of many foreign fighters and this idea of establishing the caliphate here and now, implementing the Islamic law to the totality. This narrative, this historical narrative, that the idea that the Muslim world's been in decline because there's no caliphate with the total implementation of Islamic law, and to go back to those former great times like in the Middle Ages and in the era of the caliphs after Muhammad's death, we have to revive this caliphate where there was supposedly total implementation of Islamic law. We have to get back to that historical state. That appeals to, and the fact the Islamic State places so much emphasis on this narrative, I think gives the appeal. In terms of how they actually entered, though, that's a different issue. I mean, why is it that so many just entered in through Turkey into Syria in the first place? I think that Turkey in last year turned a blind eye to the phenomenon because they thought, well, these fighters are going in and they're fighting against the Kurdistan Worker Party, the PKK's Syrian wing, the YPG, affiliated with the Democratic Union Party, the Syrian Kurdish affiliate basically of the PKK, and saying, well, those guys, they're both enemies of us, and if they're fighting each other, that's no problem. On the other hand, of course, this year I think Turkey has become more aware of the problem of foreign fighters streaming in, and they're particularly concerned now about the possibility the Islamic State will launch an attack on Turkish soil. I don't think they will, actually. I think the Islamic State knows, has a rational calculation that doing that would get Turkey involved on the ground militarily in Syria, and it would be a huge problem for them. Turkey has recognized that this foreign fighter phenomenon just can't go unchecked, and they do consider the Islamic State to be a threat. And so they have tried to crack down on this problem of foreign fighters streaming in, and Turkey has turned to some of these other rebel coalitions in Syria, like the Syrian Revolutionaries Front, which is an FSA-banner coalition that pledges to fight the Islamic State.
Well, if we talk about what it's going to ultimately take to defeat IS, Mario Abu Zaid, I mean, we look at the example a few years back of the Sunni awakening councils in Iraq, which ultimately put down the previous manifestation of this, of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Is that what it's going to take again? I mean, because again, it goes back to my original question of, there may be a military solution to this from outside, but the ultimate solution has to come from Iraqis themselves and from Syrians.
If we need to understand this, we should go back to the experience of the Sahawat or the awakening fronts. Actually, after the success that those awakening fronts were capable of doing on the ground, and by almost completely destroying the Al-Qaeda emerging groups, we saw that the alienation of those tribal leaders and not including them in on the level of the political power by al-Baghdadi government is what actually helped in the re-emergence of such organizations and groups similar to ISIS and other than ISIS and all these extremist groups. So the main key thing, I don't believe that would be solely military. The main key element should be on two sides. First, on the political level, by reintegrating those Sunni tribal leaders and resharing, if you want, the political power with the Sunnite community and not alienating them from political power. Secondly, by strengthening and reinforcing the spirit of citizenship and giving the citizenship and the local identities major priority over the religious identity that is emerging with the development of ISIS Caliphate. Because whether we like it or not, by declaring the Islamic Caliphate, this was a success for al-Baghdadi and a very strategic move. Because
on that we are going to have to leave it. Thank you to all three of our guests. Mario Abu Zaid in Beirut, Ayman Jamal El-Tamimi in Cardiff, and Juan Cole in Michigan. Thanks very much for being with us. And of course, you can add your thoughts to this discussion. You can leave your comments on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. We're also on Twitter, @AJ Inside Story is where you'll find us. I'm Hazem Seeker. Thanks for watching. Goodbye for now.